Hello, my name is Brad Taylor, and I'm with UHY Advisors, Forensic, Litigation, and Valuation Services. The goal of the presentation today is to demystify the idea of an intangible asset valuation. You may be asking yourself, well, why is this important to me? I own a small manufacturing business. It is estimated today that intellectual property is roughly $5 to $5.5 trillion. Well, you may ask yourself again, but I own a small business. How does this impact me? Well, the important point here to remember is that the small business may have intangible assets and intellectual property and not even know it. So what we are going to do is discuss intangible asset valuation while looking at business valuation and comparing the two. You may be more familiar with business valuation. So what we're going to do is walk through why you would get a business valuation. There are typically 5 reasons. The first is what we call tax compliance. Well, that may be a state tax, may be a gift tax. And again, the purpose here is to value the business. Well, how does intangible assets come into play here? Well, what happens if the estate owner, the person who is deceased, owned a patent? Well, that patent is now part of the estate and needs to be valued. Other tax compliance purposes could be conversion to an S corporation. Well, that's one instance. The second instance we have is GAAP compliance, general accepted accounting principles. You may be familiar with 123R. It is stock options valuation. Or how about 141? It's purchase price allocation. In that instance, you may buy a company. You pay a certain price for it. The tangible assets may represent only a fraction of that cost to you. Well, in this instance, you will then need to value your intangible assets to make up the difference and split it between identifiable intangible assets and goodwill. The other instance may be 142. That is goodwill impairment. And goodwill impairment needs to be tested annually. The third instance where a business valuation would be required would be mergers and acquisitions. It could be simply you're looking to acquire somebody. On the flip side of that, it could be you're selling. Well, how would intangible assets come into play in a merger and an acquisition? Well, let's say your product is based upon the patents. What is the life cycle of those patents? What is your customer relationships? How does that affect the business and the value of the business moving forward? The fourth instance would be business planning. And the thing to remember on business planning is we can be very proactive here and try and understand the intangible assets prior to going down into a transaction, perhaps. Could be pre-acquisition planning. Perhaps it's as simple as you're trying to make a business. What happens when one individual owns a patent and another is contributing cash? Well, how do you know who gets what percentage of the business? You'd need to value that patent or that trademark, for instance. So that gives us 4 of the 5 reasons to get a business valuation and perhaps an intangible asset valuation. The 5th reason could be litigation. Often, business valuation is done for litigation for marital disputes, shareholder oppression, and things of that nature. Intangible assets could come into play here. For instance, a damaged value to the business. Well, what was damaged? Perhaps a trademark. Perhaps there was an instance where someone infringed upon a patent. What is the damage to that patent? I think a good example of this, I recently worked with a company, and they had a trademark which someone infringed upon. Well, they were actually under a breach of contract litigation for another matter, and because of that, they had to fire sale their trademark. They needed the cash to fight the other battle. Well, in this instance, we had to value the damages to that trademark. And this was a manufacturing company, basically a bottling company, very, very old technology, nothing high-tech involved here. Simple manufacturing, simple bottling. They had a trademark that was damaged, and we had to value that. So what are some examples of business entities that you may value? Well, you may value a public company. You may value a private company, a partnership. You may have to do intangible assets of that business. How about some securities? Well, maybe common stock, preferred stock, partnership interests. Those are the typical business valuations we see out there. So what are the typical types of intangible assets we're coming to? Could be customer relationships. That is one that's often seen in a purchase price allocation, the GAAP compliance I was discussing earlier. Could also be a trademark or trade name, as I discussed a few moments ago. Obviously, patents is very well known for intellectual property and intangible assets. These are some of the instances of intangible assets that people need valued. Some that you may not even think of, a contract relationship, a non-compete. These are also intangible assets that often need to be valued. Another thing to remember here, which is very important, is this is a moving process. Many people are involved in all of the stages of a business and/or intangible asset valuation. It could be management of the company, such as yourselves. It could be a business valuation person, such as UHY Advisors, FLVS. It could be your auditors. So all of these people have to be very involved in the process. The earlier everyone can get together and define the engagement and understand what the end result, where the goal you are trying to go is, helps the process along immensely. In looking at this type of analysis, is there a difference between an intangible asset and a business valuation asset? Well, we like to think yes, but you go through the same steps. One, the intangible is a little more complex and detail-oriented. It involves more time from the financial analyst in looking at data and projections and really digging in. However, the steps are very similar. So let's discuss how you do a business valuation and/or an intangible asset. Well, the first thing you would do is understand the engagement. This is very important. It is like a blueprint for your entire engagement. Would you build a house without a blueprint? Absolutely not. You'd end up with round corners even if you were looking for nice square corners. So in this instance, what do? We have to define the engagement. Define what we are looking at, what we are attempting to value. We need to know when we are valuing it. We also need to know what the standard of value is. There's many different standards of value. For instance, in tax compliance purposes, you usually are discussing fair market value. For GAAP compliance, you're usually discussing fair value. In litigation matters, it depends. The states usually will dictate what standard of value you need. All of this needs to be decided upon before we even begin our analysis, and it is the ultimate building blocks of where we are going. So now we have defined the engagement. What is it we do next? Well, we need to understand and begin our due diligence. Now, the difference here is very negligible between a business valuation and an intangible asset. You go through very similar steps. The first is you need to understand the subject company and/or the subject asset. Remember, we're trying to come up with a value of either the business or a specific asset. We need to understand what drives the value behind that. We will start with we'll start with gathering of information. It could be financial results, tax returns, could be audited statements. We often like to get press releases. Understand how the market is looking at your company, how the market is looking at your intangible assets. And another thing would be a review of your intellectual property portfolio, which is very important when we're trying to understand what intellectual property you may have. Again, we may also look for shareholder agreements. We would ask you for any business plans, trying to understand what the drivers of the value here are.